His maid quit, but the millionaire wept upon discovering the reason, the humiliation that filled the cup to overflowing. "You're useless, utterly useless. Do you know what that bottle of Chateau Lafite is worth? More than you'd earn in 3 months of work." The words struck the drawing room like a gunshot. 24 people stopped breathing simultaneously. The Waterford crystal glasses reflected the light of the $500,000 chandelier, and on the floor shimmered the remnants of the most expensive red wine that had ever crossed the threshold of that mansion. Valerie Reed was on her knees on the Italian marble, gathering the fragments of the broken bottle with hands that did not tremble, though they should have, while Mr. Richard Montgomery glared down at her from his 6'3" height with the look of one crushing an insect. Valerie was 28 years old. She had worked in that house for 3 years. 3 years of rising before the sun, of ironing shirt collars with a surgeon's precision, of remembering that the master disliked sugar in his coffee on Tuesdays but requested it with brown sugar on Sundays, of tending to every detail as if the mansion were a living organism she kept breathing. 3 years without being late a single day, without breaking anything, without making a mistake, and then that night arrived. Dinner was in honor of Richard Montgomery's most important business partner, Mr. Ethan Foster, owner of a major hotel chain across the Midwest, a man so refined in his manners that he ate soup without a sound and had never raised his voice in public in his life. The other guests included architects, high-profile attorneys, 2 senators and their wives, a retired Hollywood actress with 3 ex-husbands of distinguished lineage, and the most expensive trial lawyer in New York. It was, in short, the night Richard Montgomery's image was meant to shine like the marble of his own entryway. Valerie had served the first 3 bottles without a single error. She had brought the appetizers on time, cleared the plates with the correct hand, filled the glasses without spilling a single drop on the Egyptian cotton linen tablecloths. But the moment she approached the head of the table to serve Mr. Foster, Mr. Montgomery abruptly pulled back his chair to lean back with that proprietary gesture he had of owning the world, and the chair back struck Valerie's tray with enough force that the bottle, already opened and ready to pour, lost its balance and shattered against the marble in an explosion of glass and red wine that splattered the tablecloth, the edge of the table, and Mr. Foster's left shoe. The silence that followed was one of those that sting. Richard Montgomery stood up and then spoke. He did not lower his voice. He did not discreetly approach. He did not wait for the guests to look away before reprimanding her. On the contrary, he spoke with the clarity and volume of one who knows he has an audience and believes he deserves it. "You're useless, utterly useless." Valerie did not respond. She immediately knelt, gathered the fragments with her hands barely protected by her apron, and kept her head bowed. Inside her, something was breaking with far more care than the glass, but her face did not show it. Her face never showed anything. It was one of the things Richard Montgomery had never valued, the extraordinary dignity of that woman at moments when anyone else would have cried or argued back. 3 years working here and you still don't know how to carry a bottle. 3 years. In 3 years, I built a 2-story building. In 3 years, you haven't even learned to walk straight. Mr. Foster cleared his throat slightly. The retired actress looked at her glass with the intense concentration polite people have when they want to pretend they aren't hearing what they are hearing. One of the senator's wives bit her lip. Valerie continued to collect the glass. "And don't look at me like I'm to blame." "Look at her," Richard said, spreading his hands towards his guests, as if presenting irrefutable evidence. 20 years on the job, and she's still breaking things. Valerie had been in that house for 3 years, not 20, and had been working since she was 16, when she left Harmony Creek, West Virginia, to come work in Stanton. First in a middle-class home in Fairview, then in an upscale residence in the North Hills, then here. 12 years of work, without a single serious accident, without a single documented complaint, without a single broken plate. But Richard Montgomery didn't know that because he had never bothered to find out. "Collect all that and get out of my sight. We'll talk tomorrow about what will be deducted from your wages." Valerie finished collecting the last fragments. She stood up slowly. She held Richard Montgomery's gaze for exactly 2 seconds, no more, no less. And then she turned and walked towards the kitchen with a firm, silent step. As always, behind her, she heard Mr. Foster say with forced cordiality, attempting to salvage the evening, "Richard, these things happen." And she heard Richard respond with something she didn't want to hear. In the kitchen, Carmela, the 5-2-year-old cook who had been in that house for 7 years and was the only person Valerie had coffee with on Sundays, saw her enter and knew immediately. She said nothing, just placed her hand on Valerie's shoulder for an instant, and then turned to continue with the next course, because that was how the kitchens of the rich operated. One kept going, even if one was dying inside. Valerie washed her hands at the stainless steel sink. The water carried away a small line of blood. A fragment of glass had cut her right index finger without her noticing. She saw it without surprise. She covered the cut with the nearest kitchen towel and pressed. Outside, in the dining room, Mr. Montgomery had already resumed conversation with his guests, as if nothing had happened. That was the hardest part. Not the shouting, not the public humiliation, not the threat of a deduction. The hardest part was that for him, indeed, nothing had happened. Valerie released the towel. The cut was small. It had already stopped bleeding. Sinked into the service stairs, the same ones she climbed, and descended 40 times a day, unnoticed by anyone. And she reached her room on the 3rd floor, a 10 by 10 foot space with a twin bed, a narrow closet, a small window overlooking the back garden, and a nightstand where she kept her 3 books, her small cross, and her grandmother, Consuelo's photograph. She sat on the edge of the bed, looked at the photograph for a long moment, then stood, opened the closet, and took out the 2 brown leather suitcases she had brought from Harmony Creek 12 years earlier, and began to fold her clothes. She did not cry, did not tremble, did not curse. She folded each garment with the same care she always did everything, with precision, with calm, with the serene determination of one who has made an irrevocable decision and no longer needs to convince herself of anything. She folded her blue and white uniform, placed it on top of everything, neatly folded, like a final note. Outside, in the distance, she heard laughter from the dining room. The letter and the resignation. Mr. Alfred said that in 30 years of service, he had seen cooks, gardeners, chauffeurs, housemen, and even a French chef who arrived with his own knives and left without saying goodbye, depart from that house. But he had never seen anyone leave like Valerie Reed left that Tuesday morning. He found her at 6:40 when he went downstairs to prepare the master's breakfast. She stood by the library desk with her burgundy wool coat, the 2 brown leather suitcases at her feet, and the folded uniform over her left arm. There were no plastic bags, no makeshift boxes with half-packed items. Everything Valerie owned fit into those 2 suitcases, because Valerie had never accumulated more than she could carry alone. On the desk was a plain white envelope with 2 words handwritten in the upper corner. Mr. Montgomery. Valerie, Mr. Alfred said, and in his voice was something rarely heard there. Urgency. Good morning, Mr. Alfred, she replied in her usual voice. Wait, talk to me first. He was upset last night. You know how he is when there are important guests. Don't take it to... I'm not taking it anyway, she interrupted him gently, but without wavering. I've made my decision. The uniform is clean and ironed. The envelope contains my resignation and instructions for handling my remaining duties. Everything is settled. Mr. Alfred looked at her. He was 70 years old and had learned to recognize when someone had made a decision that allowed no turning back. Valerie had that look on her face. It wasn't the face of someone angry or someone hurt seeking to be convinced. It was the face of someone who was done. Where are you going? He asked, because he couldn't think of anything else to ask. To my grandmother's for a few days. Then I'll see. Valerie placed the uniform on the desk next to the envelope. She smoothed it with her palm once, as if bidding it farewell. Then she took her suitcases, 1 in each hand, and walked towards the main door. Mr. Alfred stood watching the envelope. He had the horrible feeling that something very important was happening, and that he, as always, would be too late to prevent it. Richard Montgomery woke at 8:17, as every day. 4-minute shower, coffee in the study, email check. It was a Tuesday morning with no urgent appointments, which in his schedule meant only 3 meetings instead of 6. He dressed in the navy blue shirt Valerie had ironed the day before, though he didn't think about that because he never thought about that, and went down to the dining room expecting coffee to be ready. It was, but it was Mr. Alfred who brought it to him, not Valerie. Where's the girl? Richard asked, without looking up from his phone. Mr. Alfred placed the tray on the table, with more care than usual. Then he placed the white envelope next to the cup. She left, sir. Richard looked up. What? Valerie left this morning. She left this for you. Richard took the envelope with that irritating deliberateness he had for anything he considered a minor matter. He opened it unhurriedly, took out a sheet, and read it. It was a handwritten letter in Valerie's small, neat script, formally communicating her immediate resignation from her position as household staff at the Montgomery residence. She indicated that she waived any pending compensation and did not require a letter of recommendation. She thanked Mr. Montgomery for her 3 years of work. She signed with her full name and flourish, and at the end, a single loose line, separated from the rest by a space. You do not deserve to know the reason. Richard read that line twice, then folded the letter and left it on the table. Have her come here. I want to talk to her. She's no longer in the house, sir. What do you mean she's no longer here? Where did she go? She didn't say. Richard took a sip of coffee. He looked out the window at the garden. The automatic sprinklers were on, and the lawn glowed with the obscene green of things that cost money. For 4 seconds, he said nothing. Fine, he said, setting down the cup. Call the agency and tell them to send someone this week. Yes, sir. Mr. Alfred collected the tray and withdrew. Richard returned to his phone, but the line remained there, in the fold of the letter on the table. You do not deserve to know the reason. He glanced at it again, frowning slightly, as if at an unbalanced account, and then stood and went to his study. What Richard Montgomery did not know, and what Mr. Alfred discovered 3 hours later while reviewing the household account books for entirely different reasons, was that Valerie Reed had not collected her last 4 paychecks, 4 months, 16 weeks. Every Friday, the automatic deposit had bounced because Valerie's bank account was closed, and she had said nothing. Mr. Alfred knew because he managed the household payments and had seen the record of failed transfers, but he had wanted to assume, that Valerie had her reasons for not claiming it. What he didn't know was where that money had gone. He searched, checked the drawers in Valerie's now empty, clean room, with no trace of anyone having lived there, and found only one thing she had left behind, or perhaps left intentionally, tucked under the mattress. A bundle of folded receipts from Stanton General Hospital, Oncology Services. Patient name, Caroline Eugenia Montgomery, the master's mother, Mr. Alfred sat on the edge of the empty bed and looked at those papers for a time he could not count. Mrs. Caroline had been hospitalized for the past 4 months in a private room at Stanton General. Richard knew. He paid the main expenses, but he never asked for details because he delegated that to the accountant. What neither Richard nor the accountant knew was that there were additional treatments, specific tests, highly specialized medications that insurance did not cover, and that Richard, with all his fortune, had not covered, simply because no one had informed him, no one except Valerie. The receipts totaled almost exactly 4 maids' salaries. Mr. Alfred folded the papers with slightly trembling hands, put them in his jacket pocket, then remained sitting in that empty, silent room, looking out the small window at the garden, and thought of Valerie's face when she said, "Everything is settled," and how her eyes showed nothing, absolutely nothing, and he wondered how much effort that level of silence must cost. A great deal, he concluded. It must cost a great deal. He stood, went to Mr. Montgomery's study, and knocked twice. "Sir," he said from the doorway, "there's something you need to know." Richard looked up from his desk with that expression of controlled impatience he had when interrupted. Mr. Alfred entered, closed the door behind him, and placed the receipts on the desk without another word. Richard looked at them, picked them up, read the first, and something in his face, for a very brief moment, ceased to be what it always was. The secret the house kept. Richard Montgomery was not a man who was ever at a loss for words. In 20 years of business, he had negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts in 3 languages. He had faced partners who lied to his face without blinking. He had received news of bankruptcies, lawsuits, and betrayals with the same coldness with which other men receive the weather report. He always had an answer for everything. It was part of what made him formidable in a boardroom and exhausting at a family dinner. But now he held a stack of receipts from Stanton General Hospital, and he said nothing. Mr. Alfred waited, standing in front of the desk with his hands clasped behind his back, in that old-school butler's posture he had learned from his own father, which meant, "I am here, but the next move is yours." Richard moved the first receipt to the bottom of the stack, read the second, then the third. 4 months of payments were detailed there, with the thoroughness of someone who knew that one day someone would review them. Date, description, amount, hospital stamp, MRI scans, second-line chemotherapy sessions, an unpronounceable medication whose cost per dose was greater than Valerie's weekly salary. And so, week after week for 4 months. "This can't be," Richard said. It wasn't a denial, it was a disguised question. "The receipts are in Mrs. Caroline's name, sir, and they are paid. I checked with the hospital by phone this morning." "With what money?" Mr. Alfred did not respond immediately. Richard looked up from the stack and at him. "Her last 4 paychecks, sir. The transfer system shows them as bounced for 4 months. Valerie never reported the error, never said anything. The silence that followed was different from the previous nights. The previous nights had been the silence of vicarious shame, the kind that occurs when a powerful man shouts at someone who cannot respond. This was another kind of silence. It was the silence of one who has just seen something that cannot be unseen. "Why?" Richard asked, and the question sounded smaller than he would have liked. "I don't know, sir. She didn't tell me." Richard placed the receipts on the desk, aligning them with the edge of the table, that mechanical gesture he had when he needed to do something with his hands while thinking. Then he stood and went to the window. The garden was perfectly trimmed, the hedges at angles that did not occur in nature, the flowers arranged by color, as if someone had decided that even plants must obey an order. "My mother knows something," he said without turning. "It's possible, sir. Did anyone else in the house know?" Mr. Alfred hesitated for an instant, an honest instant. "I saw the records of failed transfers. I assumed Valerie had a reason. I didn't ask." Richard turned. "You didn't ask?" "No, sir." There was something in Richard's gaze at that moment that Mr. Alfred could not fully decipher. It wasn't anger. It was something more uncomfortable than anger. Something Mr. Montgomery clearly did not know where to put. "Call the hospital," he finally said. "I want to speak with my mother's doctor today." "And Valeria, sir?" Richard gathered the receipts from the desk and put them in the top drawer with the movement of someone filing a problem for later. Then he sat back down at his computer. "I'll take care of it," he said. "Mr." Alfred nodded, turned, and left. In the hallway, he paused for a moment. He took out the rosary he always carried from his pocket, an olive wood rosary his wife had given him before she died, and squeezed it once between his fingers. Then he put it away and kept walking. Dr. Garrett Evans had been in oncology for 18 years and had learned to be surprised by almost nothing. He had seen wealthy families who did not visit their sick for weeks, and poor families who slept on hallway benches rather than leave their loved ones alone. He had seen men who cried, and men who signed papers without reading. He had seen everything, but Richard Montgomery's call still took him a little off guard. When was the need for that additional treatment detected? Richard asked, without long greetings, with that dry efficiency he used in all contexts, as if the entire world were a business meeting. Dr. Evans reviewed the on-screen file. "Approximately 5 months ago. Mr. Montgomery, we identified that your mother's response to the primary protocol was insufficient. We proposed a second line of treatment that is not covered by insurance." "And who authorized that treatment?" A brief pause. "A person who identified herself as a close family member of Mrs. Caroline Valerie Reed. She signed the documents and covered the payments promptly. We assumed you were informed." Richard closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. "And my mother, how is she now?" "Responding very well, sir. The second line of treatment was the correct decision. If it hadn't been initiated when it was." The doctor chose his words with the care that years of delivering bad news brings. "The prognosis would have been considerably different." Richard hung up, phone in hand, staring at the dark screen. The prognosis would have been considerably different. What the doctor hadn't said aloud, because doctors learn not to say it so directly, was that his mother probably wouldn't be alive if someone hadn't acted in time. Someone who wasn't him. Someone who didn't earn in a year what he spent on a business dinner. Someone he had called useless in front of 24 people. Richard Montgomery rose from his desk and went to the study window. From there, he could see the mansion's main entrance, the marble stairs, the columns, the limestone fountain he had brought from Morelia. All built with his money, with his effort, with the correct decisions he had made in 20 years of non-stop work. But at this moment, looking at that perfect, empty entrance, he found it hard to remember why he had wanted to build it. That afternoon, Mr. Alfred went to Valerie's room for the second time. He wasn't looking for anything. He just wanted to sit for a moment in that small, silent space, as one visits the room of someone who has left. The window still overlooked the back garden. The 5 p.m. sun entered diagonally, making the dust in the air look beautiful. Mr. Alfred sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the pale stain the nightstand had left on the wall, a lighter rectangle than the rest, where the years had protected the original paint color. There Valerie had kept her 3 books. There she had kept her cross. There she had kept her grandmother's photograph. Mr. Alfred thought of the 3 years that woman had lived in this 10 by 10 foot room, caring for a house that was not hers, for a family that was not hers, for a sick woman who was not hers, paying with her own wages for treatments no one else had bothered to see. And he thought of Mr. Montgomery downstairs with his receipts in the drawer and his face like a man whose immovable world had been shifted. "Damn man," Mr. Alfred murmured very softly, with the weary respect of one who has been saying the same thing for 30 years to no avail. Then he stood, took the rosary from his pocket, and recited a full mystery in that empty room for Valerie, because she deserved it, and because someone had to do it. The past, Richard didn't know. There was an unwritten rule in the Montgomery mansion, observed by everyone though no one had dictated it. Do not speak of the master when the master was not present, and do not speak of the master when the master was present. Mr. Alfred privately called it the law of convenient silence, and for 30 years he had observed how that law protected Richard Montgomery from knowing things that would have been good for him to know. That night, however, Mr. Alfred broke the rule. He did so because Richard asked him to, and he did so because at 70 years old, Mr. Alfred had concluded that there are times when convenient silence ceases to be convenient for anyone. They sat in the study after dinner. The master with his whiskey, Mr. Alfred with a glass of water, because he never drank alcohol during working hours, and his working hours ended when the day ended, which was basically never. "Tell me about her," Richard said. He did not say, "Tell me about Valerie." He said about her, as if naming her was something he was not yet ready to do naturally. Mr. Alfred adjusted his glass on the side table and considered where to begin. He chose the beginning, because the beginning explained everything else. Valerie arrived at this house 3 years ago, with 2 suitcases and a letter of recommendation from Mrs. Esperanza Hayes from North Hills. Mrs. Hayes told me before sending her that she was the best person she'd had in her house in 40 years of having staff. Those were her exact words. Mr. Alfred paused. "I've worked with many people, sir. In 30 years in this profession, I've seen everything. And I tell you, from the first week, I knew Valerie was different. Different how? Different in that she noticed things. She didn't just do her job, she noticed. She noticed when something was out of place before anyone said anything. She noticed when someone in the house wasn't well." Mr. Alfred chose his next words carefully. It was Valerie who noticed, almost 6 months ago, that Mrs. Caroline was losing weight in a way that wasn't normal, that she was getting fatigued climbing the stairs when she hadn't before, that the color of her skin had changed. Richard said nothing. He listened. "She mentioned it to me first. She told me, 'Mr. Alfred, the mistress isn't well. Someone should take her to the doctor. I spoke with you. Remember? I told you Mrs. Caroline looked tired.'" Richard frowned slightly. He vaguely remembered it. A passing mention. On a busy Tuesday, he had said he would call the family doctor. And he had. Yes, but weeks later, and the family doctor had said it was stress and age, and Richard had filed that diagnosis with the relief of one who doesn't want to delve deeper. "Valerie didn't let it go," Mr. Alfred continued. "She sought out information on her own, spoke directly with Mrs. Caroline's family doctor, and described the symptoms with a precision that, as Dr. Miller himself told me later, was not the description of a concerned maid. It was the description of someone who knew what they were looking for." Richard set his whiskey glass on the desk. "What do you mean by that, Mr.?" Alfred took a folded paper from his jacket pocket, unfolded it calmly, and slid it across the desk towards Richard. It was a photocopy of a university transcript. "School of Medicine, State University of New England. Name, Valerie Reed Mendoza, 2 years completed, first and second semesters of the program." Richard looked at it. "She studied medicine," he said. 2 years. She quit when she was 18. Her family didn't have the resources to continue, and she was the eldest of 4 siblings. She started working, first in Fairview, then in North Hills, then here, but she never stopped reading. She had medical books in her room, sir. I saw them several times when I went up. They were marked with marginal notes, underlined like a student's." Richard held the transcript for a moment, and then placed it on the desk without fully releasing it, as if still needing contact with something concrete. "So, it was she who identified my mother's condition. It was she who insisted until someone listened. Dr. Miller referred her to Stanton General because her symptoms required more specialized tests, and it was at Stanton General that Dr. Evans diagnosed the lymphoma, sir, at a stage where it was still treatable." The word lymphoma fell onto the desk like a stone on still water. Richard had heard it before. Dr. Evans had told him with all the clinical neutrality of a man who pronounces that term 10 times a day. But hearing it now in that context, from Mr. Alfred's lips, in the solitude of the study, where everything was quiet, had a different weight. "And when my mother started treatment?" Richard asked, his voice tighter than he himself realized. "Valerie accompanied her not every time, because she had her duties here and didn't want you to know." And Mr. Alfred paused for an instant. "And because Mrs. Caroline asked her not to tell you anything, she told her you had too much work, and she didn't want to worry you." Richard clenched his jaw. "My mother asked her to hide it from me. Mrs. Caroline has her reasons, sir. She always has. I am not one to judge them." There was a long silence. Richard stood up, went to the window, returned, that caged animal movement that appeared when he processed something he couldn't control. And the money, why didn't she claim her wages? Why didn't she tell me there was a problem with the transfers? Mr. Alfred took his glass of water, held it without drinking. I believe I know, sir, although Valerie didn't tell me directly. In the 4th month, when the treatment was becoming more expensive, Mrs. Caroline told Valerie that she could no longer ask her to continue covering the expenses, that she was going to talk to you, and Valerie replied that it wasn't necessary, that she would handle it. She handled it with her maid's salary? That's right, without telling anyone. Without telling anyone? Richard Montgomery did not respond. He stood in the center of the study, in that space between the desk and the window, with his arms slightly away from his body, as if he didn't know what to do with his hands. It was a posture Mr. Alfred had never seen him in. In 30 years of knowing that man, he had never seen him without knowing what to do with his hands. Is there anything else I don't know? Richard finally asked. And in the question, there was something that took Mr. Alfred a second to identify because it was so rare in that voice. Humility, Mr. Alfred thought of the underlined medical books. He thought of the receipts folded under the mattress. He thought of Valerie serving him coffee every morning with the punctuality of a Swiss clock, without him ever asking how she had slept. He thought of the face she made when Richard humiliated her in front of guests, that face that showed nothing, that never showed anything, and what it must cost for years to contain what one feels inside that kind of silence. There's one more thing, Mr. Alfred said. Small, but perhaps the most important. Richard looked at him. Valerie never spoke ill of you, not once. In 3 years, with all she saw and all she endured in this house, she never said a single word against you. Mr. Alfred paused. And in this profession, sir, that is rarer than you think. Richard did not respond. Mr. Alfred stood, collected his glass, and walked towards the door. Before leaving, he turned one last time. If I may offer an opinion, sir, say it. Valerie Reed didn't leave this house because you humiliated her. The humiliation was the last straw, but you filled the cup yourself for 3 years without realizing it. He left and closed the door with his usual silent care. Richard remained alone in the study. The transcript still lay on the desk. He looked at it for a moment. Valerie Reed Mendoza, School of Medicine, 2 years completed. He opened the drawer, took out the hospital receipts, and placed them next to the transcript. He looked at them both together for a time he didn't measure. Then he opened his computer and typed into the search engine, Valerie Reed Mendoza, Harmony Creek. The desperate search. Richard Montgomery had never set foot in the Maplewood Heights neighborhood in his life. Not because he had consciously decided not to, but because there are parts of cities that men like him simply do not frequent. In the same way they do not frequent bank queues, or 6 a.m. buses, or late-night pharmacies at 2 a.m., not out of malice, but out of distance, out of that invisible gap that money builds around one, without one ordering it or noticing it, until one day one has to cross it and discovers one doesn't know how to walk on the other side. The Uber dropped him off at the corner of Main and Elm, in front of a small grocery store with colorful plastic streamers and a dog asleep on the doorstep. Richard got out with his tailored suit jacket, Italian leather shoes, and his phone in hand, displaying the address he had found the night before, after 3 hours of searching. Valerie's grandmother, Clara May Henderson, lived on Independence Street, number 34, apartment 2, Maplewood Heights, Stanton. He found her through a civil records directory his lawyer had access to. It wasn't difficult. What was difficult was what came after finding the address, sitting in front of the computer at 2 a.m., staring at that address, not quite knowing what he would say when he arrived. He walked 3 blocks along an uneven sidewalk, passing houses with facades painted in colors that time had worn down to more honest versions of themselves. A yellow that had been bright and was now soft. A blue that had been electric and was now the color of the sky before rain. Children in the street, a woman sweeping her entrance with a straw broom, a food truck selling breakfast burritos, sending steam into the cool morning. Number 34 was an apartment building with a moss-green facade and a wooden gate that stood ajar. Richard entered the interior courtyard. 5 doors painted in different colors, potted plants everywhere, a cage with a pair of yellow parakeets, clothes hanging on a line that crossed the space from corner to corner like a truce flag. He knocked on the door of apartment 2. He waited. The woman who opened the door was 82 years old, under 5 feet tall, with white hair pulled back in a tight bun, a floral apron over a plaid dress, and the darkest, most direct eyes Richard had seen in a long time. She looked him up and down with the calm assessment of someone who has seen many things in her life and been impressed by very few. "You're Mr. Montgomery?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Richard confirmed, and surprised himself by adding almost reflexively, "Good morning, good morning." Mrs. Henderson looked at him for another second. "And no, I don't know where my girl is. But since you're here, come in." She stepped aside. "But I warn you, I'm 82 and have rheumatism in both knees, and I no longer have patience for beating around the bush. So if you have something to say it directly." Richard stepped inside. The interior was small, clean, and full of things with visible history. A display cabinet with framed photos of 3 generations. A small statue of the Blessed Mother with fabric flowers at its feet. A wooden table with a floral oilcloth. Chairs with hand-embroidered cushions. It smelled of fresh coffee and something sweet that Richard took a moment to identify as cinnamon. Mrs. Henderson poured him coffee without asking if he wanted any. She placed it in front of him in a blue ceramic mug and sat on the other side of the table with her own coffee in her hands, watching him with the calm of older people who have nothing left to prove to anyone. "Valerie called me on Tuesday," the lady said without preamble. "She told me what happened. Everything. Everything that matters." A pause. "That you humiliated her in front of your people. That she left, and that you would probably show up sooner or later looking for her. Because men like you don't take it well when someone leaves without giving you the last word." Richard opened his mouth and closed it again. "I don't say it with malice," Mrs. Henderson continued with a serenity more cutting than anger. "I say it because I know you, even though I don't know you. I've known many men like you in my 82 years. Men who build big things and become blind to small things. And small things," she slightly raised her mug, "are what always sustain the big ones." "Madam," Richard began, "let me finish." She didn't raise her voice. Nor did she need to. Valerie left Harmony Creek at 16 to put money into this house. Her 3 younger siblings went to school because she worked. Her mother, God rest her soul, died 4 years ago, knowing her children were well, because Valerie worked her fingers to the bone from childhood to make it so. And Valerie never complained, never asked for recognition, never demanded anyone say thank you. Mrs. Henderson set her mug on the table and crossed her arms over her chest with the authority of someone who has raised difficult people and lived to tell the tale. That girl studied medicine for 2 years with scholarships and night jobs until she couldn't anymore. She still cries when she talks about it, though not in front of just anyone. And you made her pick up glass from the floor in front of your rich friends as if she were less than nothing. Richard did not attempt to interrupt her. "Do you know what it's like to grow up knowing you're intelligent, that you can, that you have everything to go far, but that money isn't enough, and life doesn't wait?" Mrs. Henderson's voice had no tears. It had something harder than tears. "No, you don't know. You never knew. And it's not your fault for having had everything. But it is your fault for not having seen the person right in front of you." Silence. Richard's hands were wrapped around the blue ceramic mug. The coffee was getting cold, and he hadn't taken a single sip. "You're right," he said. Mrs. Henderson looked at him with an expression that wasn't exactly surprise, but something akin to the surprise of someone who didn't expect reason to arrive so soon. "You're right," she said. "You're right," Richard repeated. "I have no justification. What I did was wrong. Not just that night. Everything I didn't do in 3 years." Mrs. Henderson studied him for a long moment. She had that ability of very old and very honest people to look at someone and know if they are telling a truth or the simulation of a truth. Richard Montgomery was not a man accustomed to being evaluated in that way, and he knew it. And for some reason, he didn't quite understand. It didn't bother him. "Men like you," the lady finally said, in a slightly different tone. Less sharp, more weary. "Don't change because someone scolds them. They change when something shakes them inside." She paused. "Has it shaken you?" "Yes," Richard said, and the word came out without him calculating it. The lady nodded once, stood, went to the display cabinet, and took out a framed photograph. She placed it on the table in front of Richard. It was a photo of Valerie, around 20 years old, in a white student lab coat, smiling in front of the School of Medicine entrance. A smile Richard had never seen in the 3 years she had worked in his house, open, unreserved, of someone who still believes the world will keep its promises. "Do you know where she's working now?" Richard asked. "I already told you I don't know where she is, but do you have a way to contact her?" Mrs. Henderson picked up the photograph, put it back in the display cabinet, and stood with her back to him for a moment before replying. "I'm going to tell you something, Mr. Montgomery." She turned. "If you're going to look for my girl to ask her to come back and clean your house, don't bother. She won't go back to that place." "I won't ask her that," Richard said. "Then what are you going to ask her?" Richard didn't answer immediately. He looked at the cold coffee cup, the floral oilcloth on the table, the small statue of the Blessed Mother with its fabric flowers. And then he looked at Mrs. Henderson with an honesty that cost him something he hadn't spent in a long time. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I need to see her." The lady studied him once more, then sighed with that sigh of grandmothers who have seen too much to be naive and too much to stop having hope. "There's a diner on Liberty Street, between Pine and Main. It's called the Hope Diner." She sat down again. "I'm not telling you this because I trust you, sir. I'm telling you because I trust her. Valerie knows how to take care of herself." Richard placed the ceramic mug on the table, stood, and took his wallet from his jacket. Mrs. Henderson looked at him with a slight frown. "The coffee is free," she said dryly. Richard put his wallet away. He nodded. "Thank you, madam. Don't thank me yet." Mrs. Henderson took her mug and stood to take it to the sink. "First go, then see how it goes. And if my girl tells you to go to hell, know that you deserve it, and I'll support her." Richard stepped out into the Maplewood Heights morning with the image of Valerie in a white lab coat etched somewhere that wasn't exactly memory. The encounter and pride. The Hope Diner was not the kind of place Richard Montgomery would have entered under normal circumstances. It was a downtown diner with 3 Formica tables, a wooden counter darkened by years of leaning elbows, a ceiling fan that spun with the irregular rhythm of things that work, despite everything, and a handwritten menu on a green chalkboard offering chicken noodle soup, meatloaf, chili, and iced tea at prices Richard hadn't seen since he was a student. The facade had a hand-painted mural of an angel directly on the wall plaster, with a caption below that read, "Welcome, all who are hungry." And the door stood wide open, like the homes of people who aren't afraid of having what they have stolen, because what they have is just what's needed and nothing more. Richard entered at 12:15 p.m. The diner was full. The 3 tables were occupied by men in overalls and women in aprons, who ate with the speed of those with a half-hour break who want to make the most of it. Behind the counter, a woman with her hair tied back under a hairnet shouted towards the kitchen, "2 chilies and 1 soup, chas." And from the kitchen, a young voice replied that Richard recognized before seeing whom it belonged to, because he had heard that voice for 3 years tell him, "Breakfast is ready, sir," and "Do you need anything else, sir?" and "Good evening, sir," always with that same calm cadence, without urgency or resentment. Valerie came out of the kitchen with 2 plates on each arm. She didn't see him immediately. She went directly to the back table. She set the plates down with a precision that was exactly the same as she had in the mansion's dining room, without spilling, without tilting, without making unnecessary noise. And she said something to the diners that made the man in the blue overalls laugh. Then she turned to go back to the kitchen and saw him. Both stopped. The ceiling fan continued to spin. The woman at the counter continued talking. Conversations at the 3 tables continued their course. Only the 2 of them paused in the 4 yards that separated them, looking at each other with that kind of recognition that needs no words because it has too many behind it. Valerie was the first to move. She turned and went into the kitchen. Richard waited by the counter. The woman in the hairnet looked him up and down with the same equanimity with which Mrs. Henderson had looked at him that morning, and Richard began to suspect that the older women on this side of town had a tacit agreement to look at him exactly that way. "Are you eating?" the woman asked. "Yes," Richard said, because he couldn't think of another answer. "Sit down. I'll be with you in a moment." He sat at the only free spot, a stool at the counter in front of a plate of red sauce and a basket of tortillas. He waited. 6 minutes passed. He counted them unintentionally, an old executive habit, until Valerie came out of the kitchen with a cup of stew and placed it in front of him without looking at him. "Valerie," Richard said. "The menu's on the chalkboard," she said, pointing to the wall with a neutral, professional gesture. "Today we have chili and meatloaf. The stew is complimentary." She turned away. "Valerie, please." She stopped. She didn't turn immediately. There was a second, 2, during which Richard saw her back with the blue apron tied behind her. An apron different from the mansion's, simpler, made of market fabric, and he thought of how many times he had seen that back in 3 years, without thinking of any of what he now knew. She turned slowly, looked at him. "You have 5 minutes," she said. "We're in peak hour." Richard nodded. He took a breath. "I came to apologize." Valerie said nothing. She looked at him with that face Mr. Alfred had described to him, and which Richard now understood better. It wasn't indifference. It was containment. It was the face of someone who had learned not to show what she felt, because showing it in the wrong place had always cost too much. "What I did that night was wrong," Richard continued. "Not just that night, the whole 3 years. I never saw you. Never asked, never knew who you were, what you had left behind, what you did. You didn't have to know. I was your maid. You were a person living in my house. People who live in rich people's houses aren't always people to the rich, Mr. Montgomery. She said it without bitterness, with the precision of someone stating a geographical fact. That's not a reproach. It's just how it works. It shouldn't work that way. Valerie looked at him for another second. No, it shouldn't. A pause. Is that all? No. Richard clenched his hands around the cup of stew. I know about my mother, about the hospital, the receipts. Something changed in Valerie's face. Something very small, almost imperceptible, but Richard saw it because for the first time in his life, he was truly looking. Mr. Alfred. He shouldn't have. She began. Mr. Alfred did the right thing, he interrupted gently. Valerie, you saved my mother's life without telling anyone, without asking for anything in return, with your own money. Your mother was good to me, Valerie said. And in that phrase was an enormous amount of things compressed into very few words. It was the least I could do. It wasn't the least you could do. It was far more than anyone else would have done. Richard set the cup down, and I repaid that with public humiliation. Valerie looked towards the back table, where the man in the blue overalls was signaling for more tortillas. She raised her index finger in a gesture that meant one moment, and the man nodded with the ease of someone accustomed to waiting patiently, because he knows he will be well attended. I didn't come to ask you to come back, Richard said before she could speak again. I'm not that foolish. Valerie looked at him again. Then what did you come to ask me? Nothing yet. Richard held her gaze. I came to ask for your forgiveness. Just that. No conditions, no proposals, nothing you have to give me in return. Silence. The fan continued to spin. The woman at the counter shouted something into the kitchen. A truck passed outside, and the noise filled the space for a moment before fading. Okay, Valerie said in a voice that didn't reveal if she accepted or merely registered it. It's okay that you came. She took the basket of tortillas from the counter and carried it to the back table without another word. Richard remained alone in front of his cup of stew. He drank it. It was good, with hearty seasoning and a hint of jalapeno, the kind of stew not made from a recipe, but from memory. He thought that in 3 years of living in his house, Valerie had never cooked for him, because that wasn't her role, and he thought that she probably cooked like this, with the same unpretentious care she put into everything she did. When Valerie returned to the counter, he already had his wallet on the wooden surface. How much is it? The stew is complimentary, I told you. What if I want to leave a tip? Valerie looked at him with something that wasn't exactly a smile, but was also nothing more than neutrality. Leave it in the jar like everyone else, she said, pointing to a coffee tin next to the cash register where several folded bills already lay. Richard took out a bill, folded it, and put it in the tin, then stood for a moment, not quite leaving, with that unusual awkwardness of one who doesn't know how to exit a place, because he doesn't know if what just happened was enough or was nothing at all. Valerie, he said. She looked up from the counter where she was already cleaning. How are you? Richard asked. And he said it in a way that made it clear the question wasn't protocol. It was the question of someone who, for the first time, wanted to know the answer. Valerie set the rag on the counter, looked at him for a full second, and said, better than before. It wasn't a polite answer. It was an honest one. And Richard Montgomery, who for 20 years had been surrounded by polite answers that said nothing true, realized that this distinction was more important than he had believed. He left the Hope Diner at 1:10 p.m. The downtown sun fell on him, as always, indifferent and generous, to all equally. He walked a block, 2, without taking out his phone, without calling the chauffeur, without checking email. He thought of better than before for the 3 blocks he walked, until he found a stone bench next to a small fountain, where he sat down, oblivious to his tailored suit jacket, his Italian leather shoes, or any of the things that normally mattered to him in public. And he sat there for a while, looking at the water of the fountain with the strange, uncomfortable, and necessary feeling of a man who has just seen something he cannot unsee. The mother speaks. Caroline Eugenia Montgomery was 67 years old. A voice that had retained the firmness of when she managed the house with a velvet glove, and the gaze of one who has buried a husband, raised a difficult son, and survived lymphoma, and therefore no longer feared practically anything in the visible or invisible world. She had been home for 2 weeks, recovering in her room in the north wing of the mansion, with her plants by the window and her cross on the nightstand, and the 9 o'clock news that Valerie had tuned in for her on the television for months, and that she now had to find herself because Valerie was gone. That small detail, Having to find the channel herself had made her cry the first day. Not for the channel, but for everything the channel represented. It was she who called. Richard didn't know until it happened. He arrived home Thursday afternoon, still with the taste of better than before settled somewhere in his chest, and found Mr. Alfred waiting for him in the foyer with that expression that meant, "There's news, sir." "Your mother was on the phone this morning," Mr. Alfred said. "She spoke with Valerie." Richard paused. "How did she get the number?" "She's had it for a while." Mr. Alfred paused discreetly. "Mrs. Caroline keeps more things than one might think." Richard went up to the north wing without taking off his jacket. He knocked twice on his mother's door. She responded with that "come in" she had always used, the same tone with which she had responded every time he had knocked on that door throughout his life, when he was a child having nightmares, when he was a teenager needing money, when he was an adult needing advice, though he would never admit it as such. Mrs. Caroline was sitting in the armchair by the window, with a wool shawl over her shoulders and a closed book on her lap, which she clearly hadn't been reading. She watched him enter with that specific calm of mothers who have spent decades studying their children and no longer need them to speak to know what they are carrying. "Sit down, Richard." He sat on the edge of the bed opposite her. There was something in that room that always reduced him to a more manageable scale. It didn't humiliate him, it put him in proportion. "I spoke with Valerie," Mrs. Caroline said bluntly. "Alfred told me." "And what else did Alfred tell you?" "That you keep more things than one might think." Mrs. Caroline smiled faintly, a small smile that needed no more space because it held everything within. "I called her to thank her." Her voice was firm, but there was something beneath it, a different texture. "And to apologize to her, because I asked her not to tell you anything about my illness, and that put her in a position that wasn't fair to her." "Why didn't you want me to know?" Mrs. Caroline looked towards the window, at the potted plants, a fern, 2 begonias, a plant Richard couldn't name, and that Valerie had watered every third day for 3 years without anyone asking her to. "Because I know you," his mother said with that simplicity. "That is the privilege of those who have been honest their whole lives. When something worries you, you become controlling. You would have intervened in every medical decision. You would have hired private doctors who didn't know my history. You would have made my illness a business project to solve." A pause. "And I didn't want that. I wanted to heal calmly. And Valerie gave me that." Richard did not respond immediately. He knew his mother was right. He knew it with that particular discomfort of recognizing a flaw one has justified for years as a virtue. "What did she tell you when you called her?" Mrs. Caroline looked at him again. "She told me she was fine, that she was working, that I shouldn't worry about her." Another pause. "I asked her if she could forgive you, and she told me it wasn't something she had decided yet, but that it wasn't closed either." "She said that?" "That's what she said." Mrs. Caroline adjusted the shawl over her shoulders. "Valerie is not a woman who says more than she feels or less than she thinks. She's one of the few people I've met in my life who have those two things perfectly calibrated." Richard looked at the floor, at the Persian rug that had been in that room for as long as he could remember, worn in the center by 50 years of footsteps, still retaining at the edges the original red it once had everywhere. "Mom," he said, "did you know she had studied medicine? She told me herself one afternoon." Mrs. Caroline smiled again, more broadly this time. "She showed me the books she had. She explained what she was reading." A pause laden with something that wasn't exactly sadness, but resembled it. "Richard, that girl has an extraordinary mind, not just intelligence. She has that rare ability to see things clearly, without fear clouding her judgment. It's what made her detect my symptoms when no one else saw them. It wasn't luck, it was because she knows how to look. I didn't know how to look." "No, you didn't." She said it without cruelty and without softness. She said it as a fact, with the specific love of a mother who has finished protecting her son from the truth, because she knows that the truth is the only thing that can help him. "And now?" Mrs. Caroline asked. "I went to see her today. I asked for her forgiveness, and she told me it was good that I had come and that she was better than before." Mrs. Caroline nodded slowly, as if processing that information with the same calm with which she processed everything. "Do you know what that means?" "She said she's better without me, that she's fine," his mother corrected precisely. "Valerie didn't tell you that to hurt you. She told you because it's true, and because she's the kind of woman who tells you the truth, even if it hurts, even if it's uncomfortable, even if you haven't deserved it yet." She paused. "That, Richard, is worth more than anything you've ever paid her in her entire life." Richard remained silent for a moment. "She spoke of you, you know," Mrs. Caroline continued, in a voice that had become softer, more private, as when speaking of something that truly matters. "Before all this happened, she once told me, while taking my blood pressure, that you were a man who had built so much outwardly that you no longer knew how to build inwardly. A pause. She didn't say it with anger. She said it with, she searched for the word with pity, as when one sees someone lost and wishes to help them, but cannot because that person has to find their own way. Richard looked up. She said that about me? She said that, and I thought she was right. And I also thought it was extraordinary that someone who cleaned your house and served your coffee saw you more clearly than you saw yourself. Silence. The fern in the window moved slightly with the air current from the fan. Outside in the garden, the automatic sprinklers turned on with that soft hiss every afternoon. "What are you going to do, Mrs.?" Caroline asked. "I don't know yet," Richard said, "but I'm going to do something. Something good. I'll try, Mrs." Caroline looked at him for a long moment, then extended her hand and placed it over his in that old and simple gesture she had had since he was a child, and which simply meant, "I love you, and I believe you, and I am here." "Good," she said. "Then do it right, Richard, not your way. Truly right." Richard covered his mother's hand with his own and said nothing more, because there was nothing more to say, and because sometimes the silence shared with someone who truly knows you is the closest thing to peace one can find on a complicated afternoon. Outside, the sprinklers continued to turn over the lawn that cost money and that Valerie had cared for 3 years, among dozens of other things, in silence. The deeper truth. On Friday morning, Richard Montgomery did something he hadn't done in 20 years of professional life. He cancelled all his meetings. He didn't postpone them, didn't delegate them, didn't send a representative. He cancelled them. His assistant, Martha, processed the instruction with the disciplined silence of one who has learned not to ask questions about sudden agenda changes, although inside she registered that this was, in her 6 years working for him, absolutely unprecedented. Richard left at 10 a.m. without a chauffeur, without a jacket, in the same jeans and long-sleeved white shirt he had put on without thinking, as if the absence of an agenda had also freed him from the obligation to present himself. In a way, he returned to the Hope Diner. This time it wasn't peak hour. It was 10:20 a.m., and the diner was almost empty. An older woman was having coffee alone at the corner table, an elderly man with a newspaper and chili, and Valerie was in the back, cleaning tables, with that efficient, circular motion she had for everything she did with her hands. She saw him enter, but she didn't stop. Richard sat on the same stool at the counter as before. The woman in the hairnet brought him coffee without asking. Like someone who is already a regular, even if he had only been there once, which is the particular gift of good diners. They recognize you before you decide if you'll come back. Valerie finished cleaning the table, picked up the rag, and went to the counter. She looked at him with that calibrated gaze. Richard had already learned to read as a question. "What do you want now?" "I came to tell you something," Richard said. "Something I discovered, and that I believe you have a right to know, even if it changes nothing." Valerie leaned slightly against the inner edge of the counter with her arms crossed in a posture that wasn't hostile, but simply that of someone listening without committing herself yet. "The day before you left," Richard said, "I was in the study with my partner, Ethan Foster. We were talking about staff restructuring in his hotels, and he asked me how I handled domestic staff turnover, if it caused me problems. Valerie said nothing. She listened, and I replied. Richard paused briefly, not calculating, but like someone telling himself something difficult while telling it to another. That domestic staff have no dignity to protect, because that's what they're paid for, to endure what one doesn't want to endure. The silence that followed was different from all previous silences. It wasn't the silence of the room full of guests, nor that of the study with Mr. Alfred, nor that of the diner at peak hour. It was a small, precise silence, the exact size of the words that had just been spoken. Valerie didn't move a muscle in her face, but something in her eyes changed. It didn't harden. On the contrary, it softened, as when a very tense surface suddenly relaxes because there's no longer any point in holding it. "Did you know I heard that?" she asked. "I didn't know until yesterday when I really started to think about what had happened." Richard held her gaze. "Your letter said I didn't deserve to know the reason, and you were right. But I needed to understand it anyway, even if I didn't deserve to. So I thought about it until I found it." Valerie took a moment to respond. "That was it," she confirmed in a voice that was absolutely flat, without drama, without active reproach. "It wasn't the broken glass. It wasn't the humiliation in front of your guests. That hurt, yes, but that can be endured when you know the person saying it has something good inside, even if they don't show it. And what changed? That I heard that." Valerie uncrossed her arms and placed her hands on the counter like someone finally setting something heavy on a flat surface. 3 years, Mr. Montgomery. 3 years, caring for that house, caring for your mother, Getting up before the sun, ironing your shirts with the exact fold you like, learning how you like your coffee on Tuesdays and how you want it on Sundays. 3 years respecting you, even though you never knew I was doing it. Because for me, respect doesn't depend on the other person knowing. She paused. The older woman in the corner quietly asked for more coffee, and the woman in the hairnet brought it to her without interrupting anything. And then I heard that domestic staff have no dignity to protect. Valerie said it without raising her voice, and I thought, if that's what you believe about the people who work in your house, then everything I've done in 3 years hasn't existed for you. I'm not a person in that house. I'm a function. And you can endure mistreatment from someone who's angry. What you can't endure is discovering that someone sees you as something without an inner life. Richard did not respond immediately. Valerie's words were not shouted or charged with anger, and precisely for that reason, they sank so deeply, because silent pain always carries more weight than noisy pain. Did you respect me? Richard finally asked, and the question came out with an honesty that surprised even himself, as if he had decided, without deciding, that this was the only place he could still be completely direct. Valerie looked at him. Yes, she said, more than you deserved with how little effort you made to deserve it. But that's just how I am. I respect people for what they do, not just for how they treat me. And you built important things. You generated work for many people. You cared for your mother in your own way, even if it wasn't enough. She paused. But that sentence told me that you never, at any moment, truly saw me. You're right, Richard said. I didn't see you. No, I'm sorry. I know. Not as a mere phrase. I'm truly sorry. Valerie looked at him for a moment that Richard didn't know how long it lasted, because he had stopped measuring time since he entered that diner for the second time. I know, she repeated, and this time the tone was slightly different. Not warmer exactly, but more real, like the difference between a closed door and a door that isn't locked, though not fully open yet either. Can I ask you something? Richard said. Ask. What would it take for you to be able to believe me? Valerie considered the question, not hastily, but with the same calm with which she considered everything that calm. Richard had taken 3 years, and a resignation to learn to recognize for what it was. Not coldness, but the specific serenity of someone who has learned to think before speaking, because the world has not always been kind to what she says. I don't know yet, she finally said, but it's a good question, and with that, she turned, took a tray with clean cups, and went to arrange them behind the counter, leaving Richard Montgomery sitting in front of his coffee with the strange, uncomfortable, necessary feeling of a man who has just asked the right question for the first time in a long time and is willing to wait for the answer, even if he doesn't know how long it will take. The woman in the hairnet refilled his coffee without him asking. Richard drank it slowly. Outside on Liberty Street, the city remained the noisy, irregular city, full of people carrying their own stories, unaware that 4 yards away, in a diner with an angel painted on the facade, 2 people were in the slow and difficult process of learning to see each other. The millionaire's tears and the new beginning. 3 weeks passed. Richard Montgomery returned to the Hope Diner the following Monday, and on Wednesday, and on Friday. He didn't always speak with Valerie. Sometimes he arrived, had his coffee, left a tip in the coffee tin, and left without more than 10 words passing between them. But he returned, and she let him return, which was no small thing. The 3rd week, on a Tuesday of light rain, he arrived with a folder under his arm. Valerie saw him enter from the kitchen and felt something she had been feeling for days, without yet knowing how to name it. A mixture of cautiousness and curiosity, like when one peers into a place one knows might be dangerous, but also knows holds something worth seeing. He sat at the counter, placed the folder on the wooden surface. I want to show you something, he said. No pressure, I just want you to see it. The hour was quiet. Valerie dried her hands on her apron and approached. He opened the folder. They were papers from the State University of New England, specifically the School of Medicine, a reintegration program for students with interrupted studies, course credit validation, accelerated tutoring system, the possibility of re-enrollment in the 3rd semester, with validation of documented practical experience. There was also a letter from a private foundation with no Richard Montgomery letterhead anywhere, no direct reference to him, offering a full living stipend scholarship for candidates who met certain criteria, having started medical studies, having interrupted them for financial reasons, being under 35, demonstrating ability through an interview with the committee. Valerie read everything in silence. She went through each page calmly, unhurriedly, with that way she had of reading, as if each page deserved the full time it needed. Finally, she closed the folder and left it on the counter, "Is this your foundation?" she asked. "No," Richard said. "It's my mother's. She registered it 15 days ago. She wanted to do it. I just helped with the paperwork." Valerie looked at the folder for another moment. "Why isn't your name on it anywhere?" "Because it's not for me, it's for you. And if my name appears on something that's for you, it ceases to be completely for you." Silence. The rain continued outside, soft and steady, the kind of autumnal rain that doesn't scare but accompanies. "And if I accept this," Valerie said in a voice that was careful, but not cold, "it won't be because I feel indebted to you or your mother. I would do it for myself. That's why I'm offering it to you," Richard said, "because you deserve it for yourself, not for what you did for us. What you did for us, we already repaid badly, and karma will collect when it pleases. This is separate, Valerie." She looked at him. "When did you decide to do this?" Richard rested his elbows on the counter. He looked at his coffee for a moment before answering. "The night I first read your transcript. I was in the study. It was 2 a.m., and I thought of the photo your grandmother showed me. You in a white lab coat, smiling in front of the faculty." He paused. "And I thought that the world is a considerably worse place because that smile didn't become a doctor, and that if there was anything I could do to make it happen, even if it was late, even if it no longer changed anything between us, I had to do it." Valerie did not respond immediately. There was a long silence, the kind that has its own texture, dense, with things neither of them was saying, but which floated in the space between them, like the steam from freshly poured coffee. And then, something happened that Richard Montgomery had not anticipated. Valerie Reed, who in 3 years of working in his house had never cried in front of him, who had picked up glass from the floor with a cut finger without saying anything, who had resigned with a 2-paragraph letter and a 6-word phrase, who had survived 12 years away from her home and her dream with a dignity that would have shamed people with 3 times her resources, closed her eyes for a second, and when she opened them, there were tears. They were not tears of sadness. They were the kind that come when one has been carrying something heavy for a long time and suddenly someone sees it and offers to help carry it, and the body doesn't know how to react other than by loosening everything that had been tense to hold it. She quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, with that discreet modesty of someone not accustomed to crying in public. "I'm sorry," she said. "No," Richard said, "don't apologize." And then he was the one who surprised himself, because he felt something in his chest he couldn't name at the moment, but would recognize later, in the stillness of his study that night, as the specific combination of shame and gratitude and something newer, something that didn't quite have form yet, but that pushed outwards with a pressure that had been building for weeks behind everything he had discovered, and everything he had understood, and everything he had had to look at in the mirror and acknowledge his eyes blurred. Richard Montgomery, who had not cried in public since his father's funeral, who had learned as a child that men of his class kept such things for closed rooms and lonely years, who had built 20 years of adult life on the foundation of never showing what it cost him, felt the tears coming and, for the first time in a long time, did not make an effort to stop them. He did not cry from sadness. He cried from real shame, the only kind that transforms, the kind that comes from seeing oneself clearly and not liking what one sees, but knowing that there is still time to be different. He also cried from relief, that strange, physical relief of letting go of something one has been carrying for so long that one no longer remembers the weight. And he cried from something that had no name yet, but had the form of a woman in a white lab coat smiling in front of a faculty, and of an 2-year-old grandmother who had told him the truth without asking permission, and of a butler who prayed alone in empty rooms, and of a mother who had placed her hand on his and said, "Richard, do it right, truly right." The woman in the hairnet peeked from the kitchen, saw what there was to see, and with the practical wisdom of people who have been serving coffee to people in their difficult moments for years, she went back into the kitchen and gently closed the door. Valerie said nothing, neither moved towards him nor away. She let him be in it, which is the most respectful thing one can do when someone truly cries, not to interrupt, not to console too quickly, not to reduce the moment to something manageable before it finishes being what it needs to be. When Richard wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, Valerie put the folder under her own arm. "I'll take this," she said, to read it carefully. "Okay," Richard said. "I'm not saying yes yet. I know. You're saying you'll think about it. It's more than I expected." Valerie looked at him for a moment, and then said something Richard didn't expect. "You know you don't have to buy this, right?" "What? Forgiveness? Mine or your own?" Valerie held his gaze with her usual serenity, but now there was something more behind it, something that wasn't hardness, but openness. "You don't have to set up a scholarship, or pull strings, or show up with folders under your arm. That helps. Yes. But what really changes things is what you've already done. Coming, listening, not defending yourself that can't be bought. Richard didn't respond. He nodded once slowly. One condition, Valerie said. Anything you want. If I accept the scholarship, if I go back to college, if one day I become a doctor, she paused. You're going to learn to treat the people who clean your world. Not for me, for them, all those who were there before me, and all those who will be after. Learn to see them. Richard looked at her for a long moment. I'll try, he said. Not try. Yes or no? Yes, Richard said. Valerie nodded. She turned to go back to the kitchen. Then she paused one last time at the doorway, with the folder under her arm and the rain outside, and the fan spinning above, and the angel painted on the facade, looking inward with that expression of popular saints who always seem aware of everything and approve more than they say. Enjoy your meal, Mr. Montgomery, she said, and for the first time in history, those words didn't sound like the words of a maid to her employer. They sounded like the words of one person to another, simple, direct, weighted with the exact measure of everything that had passed between them and the still fragile, still open possibility of what could come. Richard returned to his coffee. Outside, the October rain continued to fall over Stanton, making no distinction between mansions and apartment buildings, between automatically watered gardens and potted begonias, between expensive roofs and simple roofs, with that absolute democracy of water that wets everything it finds and doesn't ask how much it costs. What is built when there is nothing left to prove? 6 months passed. It was not a cinematic transformation. There was no exact moment when everything changed at once. No scene where the music swelled and the two looked at each other from opposite sides of a lighted hallway, and the world reorganized itself around that instant. Real life doesn't work that way. And Valerie Reed was too intelligent to believe in those versions of things. And Richard Montgomery was learning slowly and with effort to respect that intelligence instead of being intimidated by it. What there was this. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at the Hope Diner. Coffee, conversation, sometimes silence, sometimes a question from him that she answered with more depth than he had expected, and sometimes a question from her that left him without an immediate answer, and that he took home to ponder alone at night in the study that had slowly ceased to be the place where he locked himself away with his work and had begun to be the place where he sat to think about things that had no measurable economic return. Valerie accepted the scholarship in the 3rd week of November. She did it in person, at the diner at 11 a.m. on a rainless Thursday, with the sun streaming obliquely through the open door. She placed the folder on the counter, already signed, with the reintegration documents attached, and slid it towards him without ceremony. I thought it over carefully, she said. And? Richard asked. And I still want to be a doctor more than I care where the money comes from to do it. A pause. As long as it's clear that this doesn't obligate me to anything with you, it doesn't obligate you to anything. Good. And with that, she returned to the kitchen, and Richard Montgomery was left with the signed folder in his hands and a feeling in his chest that took several days to identify as pride, not his own, but the kind one feels when someone one respects does something brave. Valerie's first day of classes at the School of Medicine was a cold, clear Monday in January, with that winter blue sky in Stanton that seems washed clean overnight for the morning. She arrived early as always with her brown backpack and new notebooks, and that way of walking she had with her head held high and a firm step like someone who knows where she's going, even if she doesn't yet know all the paths to get there. She didn't tell Richard how her day had gone, nor did she have to. But on Tuesday, when he arrived at the diner, she was explaining something about anatomy to the man with the newspaper, who turned out to be a 70-year-old man who had wanted to study medicine as a young man and never could, and who had become a regular customer of the diner, partly for the chili, and partly because Valerie sometimes told him things she had learned, and his eyes shone in a way that reminded the woman in the hairnet of the sea. Richard sat on his stool, had his coffee, and listened without interrupting as Valerie explained to the man with the newspaper the difference between epithelial tissue and connective tissue, with a clarity and patience not learned in any book, but in the genuine conviction that what one is telling is worth telling. When the man with the newspaper left, satisfied and with homework to look for an old biology book at home that he said he had saved since the 70s, Valerie returned to the counter and found Richard looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just watching you." Valerie looked at him for a second, and you're right, that the world is a worse place without doctors like you. He paused. "Even if you're not a doctor yet, Valerie said with a particular emphasis on that word that was both correction and promise. It was in March when things began to be different, in a way that was no longer just the reconstruction of something broken, but the construction of something new, which is an entirely different process, because it has no reference plan or known materials, and one has to discover the form as one molds it. Richard arrived on a Wednesday with a question that was not about business or forgiveness or anything that had come before. "Why medicine?" he asked. "Of all the things you could have chosen." Valerie was cleaning glasses and didn't stop, "Because when I was 12, my father got sick," she said. "Something with his heart, it wasn't serious. But in the town where we lived, there were no doctors nearby, and no one knew what to do for days. My mother prayed, my aunts made home remedies, and I sat next to my father all night thinking, someone should know what to do. Someone should have the answers when others don't." She put the clean glass in its place. He recovered, but I was left with that, with wanting to be the person who knows what to do when others don't know. A pause, not to be important, but so that no one has to sit next to someone they love without being able to do anything. Richard didn't respond for a moment. "And your father?" he asked afterwards. "He died when I was 20. Other things. I had already left college." She said it without drama, like someone stating map coordinates. "I didn't get to be the doctor I wanted to be for him, but I can be for someone else." Richard looked at his coffee. "What you said before," he said, "that I built a lot outwardly and didn't know how to build inwardly. I said that months ago. I know. I thought about it a lot." He looked up. "I think my father was the same, and that I learned from him without questioning it, and that I didn't realize it until someone told me directly." Valerie looked at him. "And what are you going to do with that now?" "Try to do it differently," Richard said. "I don't know if I'll always succeed, probably not, but at least now I see it. Before, I didn't even see it." Valerie nodded once slowly with the same gesture Mr. Alfred used when something seemed true to him, but still insufficient to celebrate, which is the honest response to work in progress that is not yet finished. "That's something," she said. "Yes," Richard said. "It is something." Mr. Alfred knew before anyone else how things were changing, because Mr. Alfred had been reading that house for 30 years like others read the newspaper, with attention, with context, without illusions, but without cynicism either. He knew it when the master began arriving for dinner at 8 instead of 10. He knew it when he stopped checking his phone at the table. He knew it when one morning he came down to the kitchen himself, without calling anyone, and asked Carmela, the cook, how to prepare the stew they made at the diner on Liberty Street, because he wanted to learn how to make it. Carmela looked at him as if he had asked how to fly. "Sir, with all due respect," she said, "you've never boiled water in your life." "That's why I'm asking," Richard said. Mr. Alfred, who was listening from the hallway, had to cover his mouth with his hand to keep from laughing. Then he took his rosary from his pocket, squeezed it once, and put it away with the specific satisfaction of one who has been praying for something for a long time, and is beginning to see things move slowly, but move they do. The day Valerie and Richard walked together for the first time was a Saturday in April, without a plan, without a declared purpose. He arrived at the diner at noon and found her closing because the woman in the hairnet had a grandchild's birthday, and they had closed early. "Where are you going?" Richard asked. "Nowhere urgent," Valerie said. "May I walk with you for a bit?" Valerie looked at him, assessed him. It was what she always did before deciding something, not doubting, but honestly measuring if it made sense. "A while," she said. They walked through downtown, by the town square, by the old historic landmarks, through the cobblestone streets, where food stalls and balloon vendors, and old couples on benches formed that particular fabric of a city that has been lived in for centuries and shows it without shame. They talked about their families, about Harmony Creek, and about Valerie's siblings, who had studied thanks to her, and who now had their own lives, with their own jobs, and their own small children, who called her Aunt Val on Sundays. About Richard's mother, who was doing better, who had started going out into the garden in the mornings, who had asked Carmela to teach her how to cook a traditional stew, saying she wanted to learn before her time. To learn, things ran out. "Your mother and I are more alike than I thought," Valerie said at one point. "In what way?" "In that we both wasted time waiting for someone else to see what we needed. And in that, we both reached a point where we decided to stop waiting." Richard walked a step in silence. "And me? How am I like my father?" "I don't know yet," Valerie said, "but you seem less and less like him." It was the strangest compliment Richard had ever received, and also, though he couldn't fully explain why, the one that mattered most to him. They stopped in front of a small fountain in a secondary plaza, one of those that don't appear in tourist guides because they are too mundane to merit mention, but that have been there for decades, receiving coins from people who still believe it's worth asking something of the water. "What would you wish for from the fountain?" Valerie asked, looking at the water. Richard considered the question with the seriousness she gave everything. "That time is enough," he finally said. "For what? To do it right." A pause. "For all the years I didn't." Valerie looked at the water for another moment, then reached into her coat pocket, took out a quarter, and placed it in Richard's palm without saying anything. He looked at it. "For me, so you can make a wish," she said. "I made mine a long time ago. I think it's being granted." Richard closed his fingers around the coin, looked at it for a second, and tossed it into the water. He didn't say aloud what he wished for, but Valerie, who had spent months learning to read that face that previously had no reason to be read, believed she understood it anyway and said nothing, because some things are better respected in silence than with words, and because the fountain, in any case, already knew what it needed to know. They continued walking outside the downtown area. Stanton remained that enormous, complicated, and beautiful city that had not asked either of them permission to shape them as it had. Her with scarcity and dignity and underlined books in 10 by 10-foot rooms. Him with money and loneliness and the habit of not looking at what was inconvenient to see. Two people built by the same city in such different ways that it should be impossible for them to find something in common. And yet, there they were, walking on the same uneven sidewalks under the same blue April sky, with the same coin tossed into the same water, asking, without knowing it, for exactly the same thing. Time. Time to do it right. Time to build inwardly now. Mr. Alfred recited the full rosary that night. All 5 mysteries, for the first time in years. Not because things were resolved, they weren't, and he knew it, and they knew it, and that was fine because important things are rarely resolved all at once, but rather little by little in daily work and honest conversations, and the sustained effort of 2 people who decide each day to keep trying. He prayed because things were moving, because the master had come down to ask how the stew was made, because Valerie was back in a classroom in a white lab coat with underlined notebooks, because Mrs. Caroline was going out into the garden in the mornings, because sometimes life, with all its tendency to disorder and injustice and being late, still arrives. The day everything had a name. There was an unwritten tradition at the State University of New England School of Medicine that incoming students didn't know until someone told them. On the last Friday of each month, professors in the first semesters asked their students to write on an anonymous sheet of paper the answer to a single question: why do you want to be a doctor? It wasn't graded. It wasn't read aloud without permission. It was a private, almost ritualistic exercise that Dr. Villalobos, second semester anatomy, 40 years teaching and still in the habit of arriving 10 minutes before his students, had instituted, because he said that doctors who forget why they started are the ones who end up causing harm without knowing it. Valerie wrote it in April, on a Friday of soft rain, in her small, neat handwriting that occupied exactly the space it needed and no more. Because once I sat next to someone I loved and didn't know what to do, and I decided I would never again be in that place without answers. Not to be important, but so that the people I love don't have to be afraid when I'm near. She folded it, handed it in, and left the class with her backpack over her shoulder and the afternoon sun entering through the faculty corridors, as if it knew that day deserved a little more light than the others. Richard learned of that tradition months later when Valerie told him about it at the diner on a Tuesday in June, almost by accident in the middle of a conversation about something else. He didn't ask what she had written, but he thought about it for days with that new habit he had developed, of taking her words and turning them over in silence until he found their depth. What he found at the bottom was this: that Valerie Reed had spent 12 years carrying a vocation that no one had helped her sustain, and that despite that, or perhaps precisely because of it, that vocation had not extinguished. It had simply waited with the specific patience of things that are true, that do not need to be cared for to remain what they are. Richard thought of how many things in his own life had waited that way, in silence, without him attending to them, and he thought that there was still time to attend to some. It was also in June when Richard Montgomery did something he hadn't done since his father died 21 years earlier. He entered a church that wasn't for a wedding or a funeral. It wasn't Sunday. It was a Wednesday afternoon, alone, without telling anyone, at Stanton Cathedral, which was 4 blocks from the diner. He entered through the side door, sat in one of the back pews, and stayed there for a long while looking at the altar, with that mixture of strangeness and familiarity of one returning to a place known from another life. He didn't exactly pray. He didn't know if he still knew how, but he thought of his father, who had also been a man of much outward and little inward, and whom he had unknowingly imitated until someone told him directly. He thought of his mother, who had learned to heal in silence because no one had given her another option. He thought of Mr. Alfred with his olive wood rosary. He thought of 2-year-old Mrs. Henderson telling him the truth without asking permission. And he thought of Valerie in the photo, in the white lab coat, in Better Than Before, in the coin, in the fountain, in all the space between what he had been and what he was trying to be, and in the work that space represented. And for the first time in a long time, that work didn't seem like a punishment, but something worth doing. He left the cathedral when the sun was already low, and the plaza was full of people returning home. He stood for a moment on the steps, looking at the city he had lived in all his life without seeing half of its parts. And he thought that Stanton was larger than he had believed, not in miles, but in layers. The last time Mr. Alfred saw Valerie at the diner was on a Thursday in July when he went, at the master's instruction, to deliver an envelope to her. Inside the envelope was a single sheet, the official certificate from Mrs. Caroline's Foundation, confirming the renewal of the scholarship for the remaining 4 years of the program, with a handwritten note in Richard's script on the margin that read simply, "No conditions, no debt, nothing to return." Valerie read the sheet, folded the envelope, and put it in her backpack. "How is the master?" she asked Mr. Alfred. He considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "He's learning," he said. "Slowly, but he's learning." Valerie nodded. "And you, Mr. Alfred, how are you?" Mr. Alfred smiled. It was a question few people asked him, and that Valerie had always asked him, from the first day she arrived at the house, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to ask how the person serving the coffee was, before worrying about the coffee. "Well, Valerie," he said, "better than in a long time." She placed her hand on his arm for a moment, that simple and sufficient gesture she had for things that truly mattered. Then she went to attend to a customer who had just entered, and Mr. Alfred stood at the door of the Hope Diner, looking at the interior of that small diner full of July light, with its ceiling fan, and its 3 Formica tables, and its angel painted on the facade. And he thought that there are places in the world that have more soul than palaces, and that one only learns to see them when one stops measuring things by what they cost. He went out onto Liberty Street with the tranquil stride of his 70 years, and the olive wood rosary in his pocket, which was all he needed to carry. The day everything had a name was a Saturday in August, with a white sky of high clouds, and the air with that particular smell of Stanton in the rainy season. Wet earth, flowers, something that cannot be entirely identified, but that locals recognize as their own since childhood. Richard arrived at the diner at noon. Valerie was finishing her shift. They left together without having planned it. They walked to the small fountain plaza where they had tossed the coin in April, and sat on a bench under a tree that offered generous and unpretentious shade. They were there for a while without speaking, which was no longer uncomfortable for them, but quite the opposite. One of the things Richard had learned in those months was that shared silence with someone you trust is a form of conversation that needs no words to say what it has to say. It was Valerie who spoke first. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me, what happened between us?" She began with her usual precision for important things. "Was unfair from the beginning. You had all the power, and I had none. And that cannot be erased or romanticized or pretended not to exist, because it did exist, and it left its marks." Richard listened without interrupting. "But it's also true," Valerie continued, "that you did something that many people with your power don't do. You stopped, you looked at yourself, and you kept standing, even though it hurt." A pause. "That doesn't erase everything, but it's real. And I'm not one of those people who ignore what's real to maintain a simpler version of things." "What are you telling me?" Richard asked in a voice that didn't try to anticipate the answer, but genuinely receive it. Valerie looked at him. "That I'm here," she said, "not as an employee, not because I owe you anything. I'm here because I decided to be, and as long as that's true, I'm going to keep being here." Richard took a moment to respond because the answer he had was too important to rush. "I'm here too," he finally said, "and I'm going to keep being here, not because I deserve it yet, but because I'm working to deserve it." Valerie nodded once, then looked towards the fountain, where the water continued to receive coins from people who still believed it was worth asking for things. And something in her face settled into an expression Richard had seen very few times, and which each time it appeared seemed to him the most valuable thing in that plaza, in that city, in those 6 months of slow, honest work. Peace. Not the peace of one who no longer expects anything, but of one who is exactly where she decided to be. "Do you know what my grandmother told me when I told her I was back in college?" Valerie said. "What did she say?" "She told me, 'My child, Life sometimes takes very long detours to bring you exactly where you always should have been. A brief pause. And then she told me that if Mr. Montgomery ever disrespected me again, I should let her know so she could personally take care of it. Richard let out a genuine, full laugh, the kind that has no calculation or image to maintain. The laugh of someone who has finally learned that laughing at oneself is one of the few graces that cost nothing and is worth a great deal. Valerie watched him laugh, and something in her face did what it did very rarely, almost never, only in moments when her guard dropped on its own because there was no longer any reason to maintain it. She smiled, not the small, contained smile of previous months. The open, unreserved smile from the photo in the white lab coat of someone who once again believes the world can keep its promises, even if it's late, even if it takes detours, even if it arrives in ways one would never have imagined. The fountain continued to receive coins, the tree continued to provide shade. Stanton continued to be that enormous, vibrant city that asks no one's permission to continue being what it is. And the two sat on that bench for as long as they wished, unhurried, without agenda, with nothing to prove to anyone, building in silence and in words and in the simple company of each other something that still didn't have a complete name, but that both recognized, each in their own way, as the beginning of something worthwhile.